Okay, part two. The complicated chaos of my mother's upbringing. All right. So, my grandfather ended up going ahead and he was a heroin addict, which that factor had gotten shielded from my mother pretty much not only or drug addict in general, but ended up escalating up to heroin. And my grandmother apparently ended up shielding that factor from not only my mom, but the rest of my uncles. So, it ended up getting found out pretty much when it was too late. Around the same time that my older sister was born, that my grandfather was a heroin addict, functioning addict, I'm guessing. But at that point, the damage was done. He ended up contracting AIDS by sharing a dirty heroin needle. Was one of the first AIDS cases in the United States. Now, that was when my mom was pregnant with my sister. So with nobody telling her that factor, she had actually been around him while pregnant. So there was factors that could have happened because at that point not as much was understood about AIDS as there is now. Alright? Well, my grandmother had to go ahead and watch him wither away. Now, despite the fact that she was quite literally watching her abuser die, that she was forced with since she was in her mid-teens because of getting pregnant at a young age, she had conflicted emotions because, quite obviously, she had been being abused for so long that for her it was just a part of life. And a part of life that would be difficult for her to be able to adjust to after he ended up dying. Which he ended up dying, I believe, when my sister was 2 years old. Alright. But not too long after, my grandmother would end up going ahead and meeting the same fate. Now, at the time, my mom was living in Ronkonkoma. They were living in Farmingville. Ultimately, part of the reason that my mom has a grudge, whether or not she realizes that this is the root of her trauma, and, the conflict with me, that ends up going ahead and causing her, complete and total ignorance towards the emotional abuse directed at me. When she was pregnant with me is when her mother ended up dying. Alright? And when her mother ended up dying, her best friend ended up going ahead and saying, hey, we'll go ahead and we'll look after the shop. We'll keep it going, keep everything running and everything while you're going to, handle all the funeral arrangements and, your grieving process. So she was appreciative of that. Well, she was pregnant with me at the time that my grandmother ended up dying. And considering the fact that there was already signs of complications, the doctors had ended up warning her that she needs to try to keep her emotions in check while I was in her womb. Because if she ended up having a breakdown, it could end up going and, causing a miscarriage. So at my grandmother's funeral, she quite literally could not cry, could not grieve because of the factor of me being inside of her. So there's a little bit of a resentment there, And keep in mind, I wasn't even born yet. So, she goes and she handles the funeral and everything. Well, there's an entire mess when it comes down to the estate. Alright? Which caused numerous of family conflicts because ultimately, in the initial will, The house had gotten separated ownership-wise to 4 parties. My mother, my Uncle Raymond, my Uncle Ralphie, and Johnny. Alright? So, when it comes down to that house, there ended up being a lot of feuding over it. Alright? Now, Raymond ended up going ahead and by that point had already relocated to Virginia after enlisting into the military, where he ended up going ahead and meeting his first wife, alright, or his wife, alright. Well, that ended up being an extremely tumultuous marriage that ended up resulting in a few kids themselves, alright, as well as questionable paternity, but we don't talk about that part. As far as, potential of the daddies, it's married, had the kids, that kid's yours. No question, no paternity, just you stuck in that, circumstance. Raymond ultimately didn't want anything to do with the house because he had already started his life in Virginia. While Johnny ended up going ahead and relocating himself also to Virginia. Alright? Now, when it came down to the relationship with Johnny and the rest of my family, it ended up being problematic in certain manners for traditional old-fashioned thinking because Johnny was gay. Now, ultimately, the way that my mom would end up going ahead and trying to justify her homophobia was, they honestly don't think Johnny's gay. I mean, ultimately, I feel like Ralphie and Raymond kept bullying him so relentlessly when we were growing up that ultimately it kind of forced that lifestyle onto him. All right, rather than believing that people can choose to be gay, and ultimately trying to peer pressure somebody into being gay doesn't actually mean that they're gay. Ultimately, she believes that it's rooted in, emotional instability because of all the trauma that was inflicted. But that's obviously her closed-minded, religious zealot bigotry kicking in. So, Johnny ended up going ahead and developing a drug habit of his own. Ultimately ended up borrowing a lot of money, not only from my mom, but from every family member involved. Alright, so Ralphie, Raymond, my mom. Johnny ended up digging himself into a huge hole. And because of the amount of debt he ended up digging himself into, my mom had said, listen, I will go ahead and I will make that debt go away. Alright? But only in exchange for your part of ownership of the house. Now keep in mind, Ralphie ended up being made executor of the will. Now Ralphie, when he was in high school, he was on the lacrosse team, apparently a real ladies' man in his prime. Alright? Ultimately, though, because of the constant conflict between Ralphie and my mother would go ahead and, sabotage his relationships, covert abuse. So that ended up causing some issues later on in Ralphie's life. Alright? Ralphie ended up in a problem where he ended up trusting the wrong person when he was living in the boroughs. And he ended up being in a closet during a cocaine bust. Alright? Or during a huge cocaine sale. Ultimately, it ended up resulting to him having to, because of the escalation, having to use the gun that he was handed, just in case things got sticky, to defend himself. You know, that ended up causing a whole lot of huge issue. So, with that problem and everything, Ralphie ended up having to evade the boroughs and had to plant himself onto the house in Long Island. So he ended up living there. Well, my grandparents were still living there. He ended up going ahead and just staying there. And, he was viewed to be the most responsible of all the kids because he stuck around. So my grandmother ended up making him the executor of the will. Not understanding, though, the factor that as the executor, there was quite a little bit of number manipulation. All right? So, ultimately, when it came to living in the house, because of the factor that my mom had to help be the caretaker for my grandmother before she was dying, my mother moved back from Ronkonkoma to Farmingville. So it was my mom, my grandmother, my sister, and, Ralphie, all living in the house. All right, up until my grandmother ended up dying. At that point, it was Ralph, my mom, and my sister that were living there. Because at that point I wasn't born yet. There had always been constant conflict between Ralphie and my mom. So literally there's not a point in my childhood that I don't remember, constant yelling and screaming over refusal of accepting boundaries, But it was quite literally a 2-bedroom townhouse that was fitting 3 people with a 4th on the way. Ralphie wasn't too happy about the factor that he now had to share that space with my mom because he was thinking that when my grandmother ended up dying, he would finally get the opportunity to live alone. That's not the way that ended up turning out. So, there was constant arguments over, whose share of what bills and all of that. All right? But then, I was born, the conflict with Robert, and not only was there conflict with Robert, but there was also conflict with Robert's other baby mama, Christina. All right, or Christine. Well, needless to say, ultimately, Christine and my mom ended up having a frenemy alliance. Because same father. But I'm pretty sure this demonstrates exactly how much of the repressed trauma that I've actually listened to when it comes to my mom. But apparently I don't listen to shit, I don't remember shit, I don't do shit. I'm, apparently completely and utterly shamelessly self-involved. I don't give a fuck about anybody else. I need to be in therapy. Yet meantime, I could go ahead and recite every single traumatic experience that I've had in their life.